This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 334, entitled Third Wave Feminists Will Either Reform or Die Out. Description. This flyer states that third wave feminism will be forced by the combined moral and political pressure of the masculists and female masculists to either reform their policy of empowering women so that they abandon their push for equal outcomes for women, that is, women quotas, in favour of equal opportunities for women that don't discriminate against men's superior genetic abilities. Otherwise, the masculists and female masculists will destroy third wave feminism by totally discrediting it with such a hatred that young women will abandon it because they want to have babies. The masculists are teaching these young women that they are being deprived from having quality babies by the third wave feminazis due to the latter's takeover of the divorce courts, making them so toxic for men that young quality men refuse to give young women their sperm. Fire itself. A little bigger. Third wave feminists will either reform or die out. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Revolution or evolution? Question mark. Masculists are not sadists, but are realists. If the feminazis do not give up their privileges in the divorce courts, thus continuing their financial massacring and destruction of the lives of one father in four, then responsible males, masculist soldiers, will, in the limit, kill them. We will not tolerate, in capitals, that they indirectly wipe out whole populations, as they're currently doing, causing in many Western countries now 2/3 of young men under 35 to reject marriage, reject paternity, the huge issue, and to spend their money on themselves. These young men are reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites, who in their female 10% smaller brained irresponsibility and short-sightedness are indirectly wiping out whole populations. That is, they have become indirect genociders and hence have to be stopped with bullets if all other more benign means fail. The masculists will use the more benign approaches initially, for example, by wiping out belief in third wave feminism, that is, the brand of feminism which aims to empower women at men's expense, in which women's power gain is men's power loss, treating the acquisition of power as a zero-sum game, that is, the gain of one group is the loss of the others. When it comes to who has the power in the divorce courts, in many Western countries, in brackets, unlike China, where custody of kids goes mostly to the father who has the money to support them, in brackets, it's the hated feminazis who have the lion's share. They exert this power with their monoconscious feminazi attitudes, feeling their gender bias, their anger bias, knowing nothing of masculist ideas, being oblivious to how women oppress men, and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, given women's oppression of men is so sustained, so extensive, lasting decades. For example, women's financial parasitism of men, women's manslavery of men, the fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's red pill nature, in brackets, not loving men, but rather loving men's sexploitability, loving what men can do for women rather than the men for themselves, etc. Close brackets. These monoconscious third-wave feminazis then treat men with a sense of revenge that their feminist doctrines teach them, that men are the enemy, men are toxic, men are to be fought against, and they do. They abuse men, they rob men, discard men as exploitable cash machines, financially destroying them and ruining men's lives at the horrible rate of 1 father in 4, a casualty rate for men far worse than in a major war. In many Western countries, the divorce rate is about a half, and in half of those divorces they are vindictive, with the divorcing wife behaving as a short-sighted, vindictive, sadistic, feminazi bitch, whose feelings the feminazi bitch-controlled divorce courts allow her to express in practice. Divorcing fathers are crucified in the hated feminazi divorce courts, having their kids ripped away from them with 90% probability in many countries, losing his house to his fluffy ex-wife so she can raise her kids in it, losing half his stuff to her, no matter how economically incompetent she was or how little she bothered to acquire a career-competent education to give her a well-paying job so that she could be a fit woman, taking financial responsibility for her own life and not expecting fluffy style to be able to parasite off the money of a man. The divorcing father will be forced by the hated fluffy feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges to pay child support to his kids he will barely see, and often forced to pay alimony for life to his fluffy ex-wife so that she can continue to parasite off his money after the divorce the way she did before the divorce, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up, in brackets, become a FIP equals financially independent person. That is, to grow up, to become a moral, adult human being, instead of remaining a hated, immoral, parasitic, manslaving, vermin fluffy. Reform of the divorce courts screams out for attention. The masculists are leading the war against them, telling the feminazis that responsible males, masculist soldiers, will, in capitals, not tolerate that the feminazis indirectly wipe out whole populations. Masculist soldiers will kill them first, for the sake of preventing the hated feminazis from being the genociders that they currently are. Now that men are being more exposed to masculist ideas, masculist anger, masculist rhetoric, masculist hatred, men are speaking up much more in public and haranguing the hated feminazis, blasting them out of the room with strong verbal male venom, clashing verbally violently with them when they come across feminazi attitudes that indirectly cause massive gender damage to men, especially in the divorce courts, or when women reject the legal passage of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, which if passed would force women to grow up to become FIPs, a prospect that terrifies fluffies, scaring them shitless. The last thing fluffies want is to have to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives, running the risk of failure the way men have always done. These fluffy parasites, these existential cowards, would far prefer to parasite off men, wiggling their twats at them to extract resources from them, to sexploit them, to fuck them young, so that men's frontal lobes switch off, in parentheses, which control planning and critical thinking, in parentheses, making these men putty to be manipulated by conniving fluffies to extract money from them, so that these gullible young males, utterly ignorant of masculist ideas, are manipulated into the role of being a manslave to a fluffy parasite, working for her, giving his financial life for her, and later, a decade after his marriage, when she has her 2 kids and the house, she divorces him, dragging him through the fluffy feminist hypocrite-controlled divorce courts, taking his kids, his money, his life. There's such a hatred, such a murderous bitterness coming from men against the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites, the third wave feminists, who show their true female attitudes towards men, seeing men as mere cash machines to be sexploited, manipulated, manslaved, that the masculists are talking increasingly about a sex war, in which the gender politicians are assassinated for creating these deeply misandrous gender laws in the first place, and murdering thousands of feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges for committing this huge gender crime against men. Common sense says that such a sex war is obviously the lesser evil than doing nothing, continuing the gender status quo in the divorce courts, not bringing in the para, etc., so that whole populations die out. Masculist theorists like myself obviously choose a sex war over total population annihilation. But this stark polarization is not necessary. There are more benign ways to solve these massive gender issues, to mend the gender laws, bring in the para, remove legal and social discriminations against men across the board. One alternative is to destroy third-wave feminism by making it so hated by both sexes that it just dies out, no longer believed in, the way witchcraft or Negro slavery is no longer believed in the 21st century. With large numbers of both sexes hating third-wave feminism, and with the term third-wave feminism or its synonyms so associated with contempt and distaste, women won't dare become third-wave feminists, otherwise they will pay such a heavy price and will reject it. The masculists hate third-wave feminazis mainly for their sadistic behaviour in the divorce courts against men, seeing men as cash machines to be abused by feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers. The masculists are now telling young women that they too should hate the third-wave feminazis because these feminazi sadists are the root cause why young women cannot persuade quality young men to give them their sperm, making these young women babyless. Young women are now really panicking as they become aware that they really are not going to have quality babies because the feminazis have made divorce so toxic for men that 2/3 of young men, and perhaps now over 90% of quality men, that is in the top 20% of males in general attractiveness as judged by women, that is 80% of women want to mate with the top 20% of men, the 80-20 rule, in parentheses, refuse to marry, reject paternity, and only pump and dump young women. With both sexes increasingly hating the third-wave feminazis, third-wave feminism is doomed. It won't be able to withstand the massive ideological and moral onslaught coming from both sexes, with the men seeing the hated third-wave feminazis as indirect genociders, and the young women seeing the hated third-wave feminazis as infanticiders, that is, causing young men to refuse to give young women their sperm due to the toxicity of the divorce courts controlled by the third-wave feminazis. So, this combined masculist, female masculist, ideological and moral onslaught against the third-wave feminist is a very definite option, and is one that will be increasingly pursued by the masculists and by masculist theorists. However, there's another option, and that is that the third-wave feminists reform themselves so that they compromise some of their goals so as to assuage the hatred of both the masculists and the female masculists so that third-wave feminism can survive. If not, if the third-wave feminists do not reform, do not compromise with the demands of the masculists and the female masculists, then they will die out, either by being killed by masculist soldiers or, as is more likely, a lot more likely, being pushed into oblivion by a massive moral and psychological pressure to abandon their deeply misandrous attitudes, particularly in the divorce courts, and rejecting the para, etc. So, just what is this further option? How would the third-wave feminists need to reform so that the masculists and female masculists become satisfied and stop their sex war against them, whether in military or moral form? Question mark. So here's a checklist of demands coming from the masculists on what third-wave feminists need to change, to compromise on, so that masculism as a moral and political ideology could afford to die off, gathering dust on the history shelves in libraries. What do the masculists want most? Obviously, reform of the divorce courts, so the gender politicians, under combined voting pressure from the masculists and female masculists, in brackets, who together amount to about 60% of the adult voting public, in brackets, are forced to mend the gender laws. Extensive social engineering will need to be undertaken so that young women are socialised by parents and taught by teachers to FIP up, become FIPs, by getting a career competent education at high school and college. making the study of calculus and a science at high school compulsory, as was the case in the old Soviet Russia, so that young women are not excluded from studying STEM, science, tech, engineering and math, nor the professions at college, so that they become career competent, earning good money as adults, not being hated fluffy parasites living off the money of gullible man-slaves whose supply the Masculists and MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, are rapidly causing to dry up, as the Masculists and MGTOWs keep getting the Masculist/MGTOW message out to men via the internet. Masculists and MGTOW moral pressure on young women with masculist slogans such as, quote, "Be fit or be manless," or "No calculus, no baby," will cause young women to fip up and study the analytic subjects, that is, math and the sciences, rather than the fluffy crap majors, that is, easier, lazier, soft option majors like English Lit, languages, history, etc., which the economy does not value and pays low salaries for. The gender politicians need to legislate the para so that men are no longer subject to the greatest sexual discrimination that exists, that is, that men do not have the same right as women to reject an unwanted pregnancy. The second wave feminists gave women the MARA, maternity rejection right, so that a woman has the legal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, a right that men do not have in any country on earth, a blatant, glaring sexual discrimination against men. The divorce laws will need to be extensively reformed. For example, custody of the kids will need to be made joint by default, so that no matter what happens to the man in a divorce court, he gets to keep his children, so that today's young men will no longer have to argue, quote, "If I face a 1 in 4 chance of losing my kids via a fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court system, then, in capital letters, why have kids at all? Question mark, exclamation mark," end quote. Alimony will need to be thrown out. The original owner or owners of the house gets to keep it. Governments will need to socially engineer young women to become FIPS, so positive discrimination in terms of paying higher salaries to male primary school teachers to attract more men to teach in primary schools, so that very young boys are not totally alienated by female giants, that is, female primary school teachers, as is the case today, so that young boys are given male role models, so that young boys can feel good about themselves as males instead of being brainwashed by monoconscious primary school teacher feminazi bitches who teach these young boys that males are toxic. It's such a feminazi doctrine, that is, that men are toxic, that is itself toxic. The Masculists see feminazis as toxic, which is why they are labelled feminazis in the first place, expressing Masculist and MGTOW hatred of them for their massive gender crimes against men. The media need to be educated far more extensively into Masculist ideas so that they spread these profoundly important social and political ideas to the millions, the billions, so that men are intellectually armed with Masculist ideas and Masculist rhetoric, so that feminazis don't dare make misandrous statements in public through fear of being verbally harangued by extremely angry and impatient Masculists in the audience who will verbally crucify such feminazi bitches, calling them, quote, "genociders, misandrous shits. You'll be shot if you continue wiping out whole populations," etc. End quote. That is, vilified in public, and as the Masculist temperature keeps rising against them, it will become the new norm for extremely angry Masculists to bitch slap these feminazis to oblivion, shutting them up. Highly articulate Masculists need to get on the media and defeat the best and hence inferior debaters of the feminazis, pointing out to the general public that third-wave feminism is indirect genocide, wiping out whole populations, so has to be stopped, and by pointing out to young women that they can equate third-wave feminism with babylessness, by telling them that the root cause why young men refuse to give them their sperm is due to the hated fluffy feminazi hypocrites having taken over the divorce courts, making marriage and paternity so toxic for males. Once the above moral and political pressure has mounted enough for the feminazis to fear for their ideologies and movements' survival, then they need to start compromising. They will have to accept the rise of the masculists, abandoning their traditional monopoly over gender discourse, accepting that from now on they will have to share the gender stage with the masculists. And since masculists are men and hence genetically superior to women, the masculists will soon dominate gender politics, since whenever men turn their minds to anything, they always dominate it, because the genii are males and men have much higher testosterone levels, making them more aggressive, more ambitious,